kind of a strange question. When was Qing poetry? This talk came to me while I was getting an eye exam. I'm really interested, as my students know, some of them are here, I really like a good metaphor. And I'm very interested in the idea that history and criticism are lenses that help bring the past into focus for us. And I've been long interested in this idea, but somehow recently when the doctor was flipping the lenses to check my prescription, 1 or 2, 2 or 3, 3 or 4, and different lines of text were coming in and out of focus, I was struck even more by this metaphor. I do think history and criticism are lenses onto the past, but what I realize is if you don't change the lens ever, you have no idea what you're not seeing. You need to change the lens. And another idea that I'm interested in is that literature is a mode of doing something. Literature is not something I think often in sort of classical literature studies, it's easy to think of literature as something static, words on a page, but I think literature is an action. And insofar it's an action, it's something that takes place within time, which is a specific arrangement of past, present, and future, as Aristotle tells us, right? So for this reason, I think it's a good first question whenever approaching any work of literature to ask, what does it do? How does it make sense of the world? And it's because I was very interested in these questions that I came to be curious about Qing poetry. In the master narratives of Chinese literary history, I think it's not clear what writing in traditional forms like those of classical poetry could do or make possible for Qing people. The lenses that we're used to looking through generally have us see a widespread poetic habitus propelled almost wholly by inertia. Poets, most of them bad poets, the most famous bad poet, Qianlong, right? Stuck with I'm not saying that, but stuck with a sclerotic language that offered very little purchase on a rapidly changing world. And many of the stories that we tell about Qing poetry, in fact, assume the inevitable arrival of modernity as it came to happen. Political and then literary revolution and a new poetry built on new global models and new ideas about atomistic individualism and national consciousness. And in this sort of paradigm, I think literary history and criticism often become exercises in what I call retrospective prolepsis, where you look for anticipations of the future that came in the past that used to be. And of course, these are very broad strokes, and there are many exceptions, but I think they offer a good heuristic for what I want to talk about today, which is not actually the Qing dynasty in general, but the era of the 18th century, the long 18th century that we call the High Qing, a time when imperial expansion, territorial expansion, technology, population, intellectual production reached zeniths that were not seen in previous historical eras. These zeniths mean that the High Qing, in the linear narratives of Chinese history, occupies a very curious inflection point, right? So it's simultaneously the maximal achievement and the beginning of the end of the old China. So the question then really is, when was the High Qing? When was High Qing poetry? What kind of time was the High Qing? And for reasons that will become clear as the talk unfolds, I find it useful to focalize these questions through the work of one High Qing poet named Huang Jingren. You can see from these dates, Huang Jingren died young, at 34. And I realized I was writing that's how old I am. So, yeah. What's more, we're pretty sure that he died from what came to be known in Europe as the Romantic disease, tuberculosis. And as often happens with poets, Huang Jingren's untimely death spawned a whole host of rumors, myths, imaginings among his readers, especially in the 20th century, once the work of other famous short-lived poets like Byron, Shelley, Keats, Rimbaud entered the Chinese literary imagination. But before he died, when he wasn't dead, Huang Jingren was known primarily for his close relationship with leading members of the philological movement that we call evidential scholarship, which is what my book is about. Evidential scholarship is this High Qing interest in verifiable knowledge, which led to the flourishing of fields such as paleography, phonology, epigraphy, geography, textual criticism, historiography. And they actually laid the foundation for most of those disciplines today. Many people, it's hard to get away from Siku Chuan Shu. It's hard to get away from Chen Tang Shi. So the way I think about evidential scholars we're trying to critically re-examine the textual basis upon which received truths about language and history had been transmitted. And in this way, they were intensely interested in the temporal structure of their world. And I think to a degree that is almost wholly unrecognized in current scholarship, Huang Jingren was the poet of evidential scholarship. In my book project, I explored the various ways that Huang Jingren gave poetic voice to these philological visions, but today I want to especially focus on the temporal dimension of that endeavor. So in the following, I offer readings that see poems in the words of Adorno as sundials telling the time of history. Okay, so this is one. Okay. But we don't start with Qing Empire, we start with British Empire. And we start at its margin on the island of Hainan with the British consul and poetry enthusiast William John Bainbridge Fletcher. In 1919, Fletcher published through commercial press in Shanghai what would become a best-selling edition of classical Chinese poems in translation titled Gems of Chinese Verse. Fletcher's translations were celebrated for opening up to English readers the, quote, poetic realm of old Cathay, much as Keats said Chapman had done for Homer, according to the preface written by an American professor at the recently created Henan Provincial University. The translations in Gems of Chinese Verse were also celebrated for their bilingual format, which allowed readers to consult the original text of the poems for themselves. Fletcher's choice to incorporate sinographs into the visual plane of Gems introduces a curious slippage from the very first page of the book, where we see another title given in Chinese. Yingyi Tang Shi Xuan, or selected Tang poems in English translation. So we learn immediately that the ostensibly Chinese verse that Fletcher mined, which Fletcher mined for Gems, turns out, in fact, to be the verse of only one particularly hallowed sector in the Chinese literary historical landscape. But Fletcher makes this clear in his introduction. He's not pulling one over on us. He says, the following translations are all from the Chinese poetry of the Tang dynasty. And it is not a little credible to Chinese civilization that such refinement of thought should be current at a period when the ancestors of Europe were overrun by German barbarians and the Scotch had perhaps barely abandoned cannibalism. What I want to call our attention to today is the very last poem in Fletcher's Gems of Chinese Verse, a piece by author unknown, whose title he chooses to translate interpretively as Lenore. He explains this choice by noting the poem's thematic resemblance to a late 18th century German Gothic ballad of that name. The Chinese title of the anonymous poem is given as Jiao Jie Fu Xing, which we might translate less interpretively as Ballad of the Chaste Wife Jiao. No matter which title we use for it, this final gem in Fletcher's collection is an extremely striking, long song composed in the music bureau tradition, wherein later writers would elaborate upon a thematic repertoire inherited from the textual ruins of the Han Dynasty institution tasked with managing music, poetry, entertainment, and ritual performance. So the theme of the anonymous Lenore is a timeless one in the Sinitic tradition, centering around the figure of the wife who stays home while her husband goes off to war in a distant land, probably to die and never return. Often these poems are composed, however problematically, by their predominantly male authors in the voice of the woman herself. And this Ballad of the Chaste Wife is a particularly striking, if macabre, example of this theme, in which the fallen soldier's husband, or the fallen soldier's husband's ghost returns one. It's complicated. Okay. The fallen soldier husband's ghost returns one night to his long-suffering wife, who then takes her own life so that the two might fly across the night sky to his burial place in the desert. I'll read from Fletcher's translation. This is the Chinese. I'll read from Fletcher's translation to give you a sense. Amid the chilly gleam, a lamp in lonely darkness gleams. The cricket chirrups by the door, some spirit present seems. A rank and sudden smell of gore rises on every side. I shriek and see a dreadful ghost. Ah, what may this betide? Its hand holds forth a hollow skull, and there it standeth grim. As there it's denied with dust and bloody stains, it loometh vaguely dim. Come in before me, indeed I do not dread. And thou indeed my husband art, what proof to prove the dead? So aside from the pretty gruesome images and rather dark narrative of the poem, we can also notice in Fletcher's manipulation of English, the syntactical inversion, the Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, the Middle English verb endings seem well suited to what would be a poem stemming from a far-off medieval age. But there's a problem, and you probably already figured out what the problem is. This is not a poem from the long-gone Han Dynasty at all, and its author is not unknown, at least not to us. Instead, it's a poem by the Qing Dynasty poet Huang Jingren, who died not even a century before Fletcher was born. So what's going on here? Somehow it seems that this poem, sort of like the dead husband's spirit, detached itself from Huang Jingren's literary collection, making itself anonymous, and traversed space and time to, quote, or what we might think of as swim into the ken of the British consul at Haikou, as he might have put it. Or perhaps it had been circulating on its own ever since Huang Jingren composed the song. What's clear, however, is that free from its what we would call metadata today, the song managed to become older than it, quote, really is. And in so doing, I think represents a unique triumph for Huang Jingren, since music bureau poetry is the traditional mode least associated with speaking, or rather singing, in one's own voice. Instead, in such works, one seeks to sing in the voice of the tradition itself, contributing a performance to the repertoire of lost ancient song. So in this strange case, when is Qing poetry? I won't answer. Okay, one or two. So, Gems of Chinese Verse, bearing the anonymous Tang Dynasty Huang Jingren, sold well enough for the commercial press that 4 years later, in 1923, it was coming off the presses in its third edition. That same year, at another publishing house in Shanghai, Huang Jingren was being reimagined as a Chinese national hero in the pages of an upstart modern literary magazine. Creation Quarterly was founded by a group of writers who met as students in Japan and would go on to become central figures in the canon of modern Chinese literature and the story of modern China. The group, which called itself the Creation Society, sought to infuse the reading public of the newborn Chinese nation with the spirit of European cultural movements like Romanticism and aestheticism. And one of the leaders of the group, Yu Dafu, published in one of the Shanghai newspapers an advance notice of, quote, Creation, a pure literary quarterly. Members of the Creation Society, Yu announced, will rise to break social conventions, advocate the independence of art, and seek to grow together with all unknown writers in order to create a national literature for future China. Building this new literature involved opening the consciousness of the nation to a new lineup of literary heroes. And to that end, the year after its founding, Creation Quarterly released a Shelley Memorial Edition, introducing readers to the life and work of the British Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. For the issue, Guo Moreau produced, oh, I don't have it. For this issue, Guo Moreau produced his historic first translations of Shelley's poetry into Chinese, including Ode to the Western Wind, further defining the style of the new style Chinese poetry. But interestingly, Guo also, and we can talk about this, Guo also produced a short traditional analytic style biography, a nianpu of Shelley's life. Yu Dafu's lone contribution to the issue was a short story titled Stone Picking Jetty, which curiously has nothing to do with Shelley at all, but rather Shelley's Qing Dynasty near contemporary Huang Jingren. The story is a sort of, it's funny, it's a sort of historical fiction set in 18th century Anhui, centered around the yamen of the provincial director of education, the gripping fiction, where Huang was employed. Yu Dafu crafts the story by interweaving classical poems from Huang's literary collection with Baihua vernacular narration that depicts him as he quarrels with colleagues, drinks into stupor, writes tortured poems about failed love affairs, and broods over perceived slights by famous philological scholars who fail to appreciate his literary genius. So Yu's choice to commemorate an old-style poet in a publication dedicated to a new poetic model may seem odd at first. But if you read this story in the context alongside the other contents of the Shelley Memorial Edition, you find that Yu Dafu's Huang Jingren bears a striking resemblance to the hot-blooded loner that his Eton College bullies called Mad Shelley. Yu Dafu's narrator unleashes a cavalcade of descriptors assuring Huang's legibility in the modern idiom of romantic genius that Shelley helped to pioneer. Nervous sensibility, aloof, paranoid, rash, sentimental, uncontrollable, depressive. This is our Huang Jingren. Yu Dafu's stone-picking jetty and the circumstances of its appearance, I think, are really interesting in the history of the story of the birth of modern Chinese literature. But I want to focus on two things today. One is a very strong focus on romantic love and sexuality. As scholars such as Haiyan Li have argued, free love and sexual liberation, insofar as they symbolized emancipation from the strictures of traditional culture, were essential discourses in the milieu that motivated the nation-building project in the early Republican era. And if anybody who's read Yu Dafu's Sinking knows that they were definitely interested in breaking taboos and pushing the limit. But what's interesting about the Creation Society is that they also framed the act of literary creation itself as something libidinous. For this group of writers, in the words of Michel Hawks, the grand project of creation was equated to the uninhibited expression of innermost desire and aspiration, which was also posited as the driving force of the universe. In this respect, the Huang Jingren of 1923 stone-picking jetty stands as a quintessentially modern Chinese romantic. When he gets stirred up, poems simply pour out of him. And what stirs him up most frequently in this story are incessant memories of a lost lover from his youth, recounted in the vernacular prose narrative as streams of consciousness, which culminate in the handful of erotically tinged regulated verses in the historical Huang Jingren's literary collection. The second datable artifact of Chinese modernity in stone-picking jetty is what Yu portrays as an irreconcilable struggle between literature and scholarship. So while the story's lyricism largely derives from Huang Jingren's turbulent urges, its plot charts the course of an elemental conflict pitting poetry against philology. The cause of problems is the arrival to the yamen of the eminent evidential scholar Dai Zhen. He is the hero of evidential scholarship. So Dai Zhen is welcomed with open arms by Huang Jingren's patron, Zhu Yun, who is the Anhui Educational Commissioner in the story. News of Dai Zhen's imminent arrival stirs Huang to an impassioned speech in which he avers that philologists like Dai are all careerist dabbling cheats responsible for the proliferation of false writings in his age. And things only get worse. This is the true heart of the story. Things only get worse the following day when at a banquet held in his honor, Dai Zhen humiliates Huang by publicly declaring his poetry to be flowery without substance, severely lacking in the spirit of fidelity and honesty, and using many wrong allusions. This affront is a heavy blow to Huang Jingren and sends him into one of his characteristic depressive spirals. So this is, I think, this is the key moment in the text. So Yu Dafu has Huang's only friend in the world, Hong Liangji, try in vain to console him with a less than subtle meta-reference to stone-picking jetty itself, suggesting that a century into the future, there will surely be people who recognize his true worth. So this, as I said, this is a crucial moment in the story, but this is actually also a crucial moment in literary history, because Yu Dafu has concocted a paradigm by which to rescue Huang Jingren from the supposed misprision of his own age. This is because if you've read Liu Fan Li's The Chinese Romantic Generation, everybody in the Creation Society knew that the supposed showdown between the poet and the philologist, a conflict for which there's zero historical evidence, was in fact a transparent allegory for Yu Dafu's ongoing feud with Hu Shi. Okay. But this didn't bother anybody. The evident presentism of Yu Dafu's allegorical rediscovery proved no great hurdle for readers, because people wanted to rescue somebody from the past. They were eager for new exemplars. And as such, they sought to claim Huang Jingren as a misunderstood, proleptic modern in a pre-modern world that could not appreciate him properly. So this has a very long... So this occasioned what one Japanese scholar calls the Huang Jingren boom. A cultural explosion. It's sort of like the Virtusfieber in German, I think, where everybody gets very excited about Huang Jingren. So Chinese readers and writers became captivated by the imagination that China had its very own romantic hero. In essays, books, and anthologies, everybody was working to reify the image of Huang as a frustrated love poet at odds with the scholarly world in which he lived. And I think there's two examples that are very telling about this. In 1925, the Useless Society member Zhang Yiping published his critical biography of Huang Jingren, in which he places Huang amongst the great madman poets of all of world history, focusing especially on Huang's supposed erotic adventures. And you might say, okay, whatever, that's fine. Everybody writes strange biographies. This became one of the main sources for Fang Zhaoying's biography of Huang Jingren in Eminent Chinese of the Qing period, one of the main biographical resources that we have for Qing history. And another, in 1929, the literary magazine Crescent Moon published an essay called Huang Jingren and His Love Poetry, which completely reinvents the history of Huang Jingren's biography around his three periods, his main three periods in life, which are his early love period, his passionate love period, and a nostalgic period, thereby solidifying his status as a love poet extraordinaire. But what I want to emphasize today, that's all well and good. What I want to emphasize today is that this Republican era image remains the dominant lens for envisioning Huang Jingren in our own time. And I cite as evidence the recently published second volume of the monumental History of Qing Poetics, written by Jiang Yin, who is perhaps one of China's most prominent scholars of Qing dynasty poetry, and the one who has taken the project to write the sort of state of the field statement on this. So the subtitle to this new book, covering the reign of the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century, is Scholarship versus Innate Feeling, a bifurcation that Zhang supports by arguing that Huang Jingren and Yuan Mei, the great bon vivant who retired from serving to pursue the pleasures of his garden estate, were both, quote, pure authors. And furthermore, in language that reads as though it were directly inspired by Yu Dafu's short story in the Shelley Memorial Edition of Creation Quarterly, Zhang suggests that Huang Jingren used, quote, inspiration and lyricism as his shield to resist the belittlement and exclusion that came from the scholarly collective. So I would call this a state of the field statement when it comes to understanding Huang Jingren's place, or rather lack of place, in his own world. And based on this view, if we were to ask, when was Qing poetry, we would have to say that Qing poetry only sort of had a possibility in modern China. Qing poetry needed to be saved in modern China. And as I say, I think this is the lens that we, if you are one of the people who's inclined to look through any lens at Qing poetry, this is the lens you look for. 2 or 3. Okay. I invite you to try this lens. So, something different. In the summer of 1776, just as the American colonists were preparing to declare their independence from the King of England, the Qianlong Emperor, 5th leader of the Manchu-ruled Qing dynasty, was rushing to the tomb of Confucius to make a declaration of his own. The emperor, who presided over the largest empire in the world and the largest in Chinese history, had just received word from his generals at the front. Victory had finally been obtained in the 5-year-long war against the Greater and Lesser Jinchuan, Tibetan kingdoms in western Sichuan that had rebelled for the second time in his rule. In accordance with new regulations governing the announcement of military victory, the Qianlong Emperor needed to travel from his palace in Beijing to the ancestral home of Confucius in Shandong, where he would personally notify Confucius's spirit of this great achievement. As he returned to the capital, Qianlong decided that a special recruitment examination should be held to commemorate the end of war and the return of peace. So unlike the regularly scheduled cycle of civil service exams that we're all familiar with, in which the majority of educated men in late imperial China could spend a lifetime, did spend lifetimes, without advancing or receiving a job in the government, this special examination was going to be different. Anybody who passed would automatically be conferred the prestigious Juren degree, where you don't have to keep taking the tests in the same schedule, and immediately appointed to an official position in the capital. And also, unlike the customary civil service exams, admission to this special examination would be based solely on poetic skill. It was, in fact, an empire-wide poetry competition. So students and scholars from around the empire were invited to submit samples of their poetry, and those whose talents were judged the best would be given the opportunity to sit for the potentially career-making test. So at this time, Huang Jingren was not quarreling with philologists. He was studying with them as an imperial college student in the capital. And so he was studying with people like Zhu Yun, Wen Fangang, Ji Yun, Wang Chang. If you know Qing intellectual history, these are the heavy hitters. And they all submitted congratulatory poems themselves. But they didn't need to sit for the special exam. Their place was secured. Huang, however, was one of those who rushed to submit poems to the emperor as he returned from the tomb of Confucius. And in an ornate preface included with his submission, Huang explains his choice to compose a new series of what he calls ancient-style now songs, commemorating the recent Qing victory over the Jinchuan rebels. I couldn't fit the English on here, but if you can't read it, I'll read it in English now. Our emperor brought under control the two Jinchuan regions. In the past, he established the subordinate ranks of the local chieftains, but before long, they treacherously unleashed disorder, disobeyed our border officials, and resisted our vanguard troops. The Grand Army advanced and punished them over a course of 5 years, with General Agui bringing to accomplishment the meritorious deed of victory. Thereupon, sacrificial announcements were made during a tour of the provinces, prisoners of war presented, and honorary titles conferred. In accordance with the fixed rules of civil officials, ever since the conquering of the Zhengger tribes more than 20,000 li away, our sacred might has been made magnificent, and our rituals and music have been resplendent. Now, with this conquest, all behold, majestic and excellent, how they surpass all preceding ages. Huang goes on to praise the Qianlong Emperor's sagely rule for terrifying through awesomeness, shaping through righteousness, entrusting worthy generals to eradicate evil, and achieving unexcelled accomplishment. Such things as these ought to be set to song and chanting in order to perpetuate your outstanding exploits. I have composed in the manner of the ancient music bureau 10 now songs, giving a title to each song. Though they are not worthy of aspiring to the manner and force of an author, they are not far from the significance of booming drums and soaring dance. If you know early China, you know that the significance of booming drums and soaring dance is a compressed citation from the ancient Song of Auspicious Clouds, lyrics that were reputedly performed during the accession of the mythical sage King Shun, wherein heaven recognized the new ruler by sending down auspicious signs. In words addressed directly to the emperor, then, Huang claims that his now songs verge on the very same divine, archaic potency. But what is a now song? You may be thinking, hopefully, or maybe you know. A now is a kind of shank-mounted bell used in antiquity to signal the movement of troops. So according to legend, the first now songs were composed for the mythical Yellow Emperor in his battle against the demon Trio. Their purpose, we read in early sources, was to establish intimidation, exalt virtue, influence the enemy, and encourage the troops. The earliest texts that survive to the present, calling themselves now songs, however, come from the traditions associated with the music bureau of the Han Dynasty, the institution, as we saw earlier, responsible for arranging ritual music at court. The Han Dynasty now songs are some of the most enigmatic and strange texts in the Chinese poetic tradition. And though they are supposedly of military origin, in many cases the lyrics were already garbled in the first transmission and unclear to their earliest readers. So I've added this. I want to give you an example of what this is not. I was thinking, how do you translate something to show that it's strange? But I think you can get the idea. So one of the things that's very interesting about these songs is that they include lots of pieces of what must be either stage direction or musical notation. So here, I won't read it for you. You can see the lines are uneven. And there's this strange sort of, there's some fragment, something's been lost in transmission. So the writing of sets of now songs, as Huang Jingren did, begins with attempts to rectify or reorder these fragments of ritual music in the aftermath of the disintegration of the Han Empire in the third dynasty. Beginning with the Wei dynasty, founded by the warlord Cao Cao, whose ritual expert composed new lyrics to replace the old, incoherent Han lyrics. Nearly every dynasty up through the 6th century composed new Now songs to extol their martial exploits. After the 5th, and this is interesting, after the 6th century, the tradition seems to have died out. And some people would produce, including Liu Zongyuan, would produce their own Now songs in private. But it doesn't seem that they were ever performed or entered the ritual repertoire. Till we get to our guy, Mr. Qianlong. In the 18th century, the Qianlong Emperor, ever eager to aggrandize the military achievement that saw him rule over the largest empire in Chinese history, took a keen interest in reviving the ancient institution. As part of the new regulations for celebrating a military victory that I mentioned, new Now songs celebrating the concluded campaign were to be composed and performed at an elaborate ceremony in which the emperor personally welcomed his returning armies and paid obeisance to heaven and his ancestors, recognizing the divine assistance that made his conquest possible. These rites were designed according to the court ritualists to make manifest the degree to which the Qing military achievement outstripped every preceding age. So what's interesting about this painting here, these are paintings that were produced by Jesuit-trained court artists. What's interesting about this painting, and as we were talking about before we started, there were also copper engravings that were produced of the same scenes. What's interesting about this painting is that when you read the Qing ritual manuals, they're very precise about the time when the Now songs are supposed to be performed. And it's precisely this moment. So this is the emperor right here. It's precisely as the emperor approaches the round platform on which he and his generals will thank heaven for victory, that the Now songs are supposed to be performed. So I have some details here from, these are the copper engravings of the same scene. And I think they're playing instruments. I'm pretty sure these bored-looking people are supposed to be singing. By the way, this is state-of-the-art technology in the 18th century. This is what Friedrich the Great is using the exact same technology to disseminate his military victories. So if you're a poet like Huang Jingren, composing ritual hymns, how do you express that your dynasty's exploits surpass those of every earlier age? This is a good question. The answer we can tell from the songs that he submitted is that you make your language more ancient than any other language. The greater the achievement, the more ancient the words in which they should be sung. So logic here, this is a very important logic and key to the poetic imagination of this time. So the unprecedented achievements of the Qing emperors, and Qianlong in particular, this is the logic. They will become for future ages what the antiquity of the past had been for their present. They will become for future ages the new antiquity. And what somebody like Huang Jingren can do, submitting songs directly to the emperor, is to create the new language, the new songs that will accomplish this transformation. And it becomes a very strange language indeed. So Huang's Now songs transcribe the glories of the Second Jinchuan campaign into the sublime register of sacred war, as recorded in the earliest texts of Chinese civilization. As a result, their language is often deeply citational or combinatory, drawing from speeches in the Book of Documents, hymns in the Book of Songs, and descriptions from the first histories to describe 18th century battles and events as though they had occurred in the Bronze Age. Thus, when the Qianlong Emperor appears in Huang Jingren's songs, he is explicitly described in pre-imperial terms. The principal word that refers to him is Di, by which the sage kings of the Book of Documents are named, and which I have translated as Lord. It places this Di in some places, this Di is modified by the adjective Huang to form the binom Huang Di that would become to mean emperor, as invented at the court of the first emperor of Qin Shi Huang in 2021 BC. But the symbolic register of these songs clearly predates that usage, and if anything, works to portray Qianlong as reinventing, or pre-inventing the very institution of emperorship itself. So the quoted speech of the Qianlong Lord in Huang Jingren songs refers to himself by the first person pronoun yu, and not the imperial pronoun zhen used by emperors from the first emperor onward. This transcription into the language of early China makes available what Mark Edward Lewis calls the rhetoric of sanctioned violence. in which war was conceived not as a contest between greater or lesser powers, but rather as righteous punishment exacted upon those who willfully ignore the virtue and majesty of the sovereign Lord. Often imagining such righteous violence manifests in bestial depictions of those to be punished, separating the humans from the animals. They're either wicked, odious monsters whose danger must be extirpated, or they're ignorant, often infant animals, unable to comprehend the severity of their transgressions. Their living places are nests, burrow caves, shrew holes. If you've read anything about war in the Chinese tradition, you know this is common language, but Huang Jingren, as Spinal Tap says, turns it up to 11. Their rhetorical moves serve to underscore the conceptual linkage between the battle and the hunt in early China that originated sanctioned violence, according to Lewis, and more importantly, was frequently appropriated by Qing military culture, in which the hunt was an important aspect. So the explicitly archaizing force of Huang's now songs reveals itself even further in the imagination of place. The name Jinchuan, either as a toponym or in reference to the Tibetan peoples who inhabited the region in which the war was waged, never appears in the song. Instead, the region and its combatants are referred to metonymically by names of people from mythic and ancient history. That is to say that the world onto which Huang's songs sing the glories of Qing Empire is a world returned to earliest times, a distant past, which was becoming the object of new knowledge through the research of evidential scholars like Huang Jingren's friends and patrons. This all becomes especially interesting when we learn that the Second Jinchuan War was one of the most technologically advanced wars to that point in human history. Amid the defining characteristics of the Qing victory was the importance of explosives and heavy weapons. The mountainous terrain in western Sichuan, you can see, which forced troops to march in single file, made it difficult to attack, particularly with the mounted forces that had theretofore been so important to the Manchu war machine. Moreover, and you can see here, the Jinchuan forces had taken up defensive positions in a seemingly endless series of entrenched stone war towers. So the Qianlong Emperor's solution to this problem, to the problems of topography and Jinchuan entrenchment, was a bombardment campaign unprecedented in Chinese history. Because the narrow mountain roads made it impossible to transport existing heavy weaponry, the Qing armies instead carried thousands of bags of metal ingots, and with the help of Jesuit advisors, cast cannons in special foundries at the front. They cast cannons in the exact place they were going to be used, with the Jesuits telling them how to do, with the Jesuits supervising everything, in the name of God, no doubt. Bearing names like mountain-splitting howitzer and heaven-piercing howitzer, these cannons allowed Qing forces to bombard the Jinchuan towers. You can see some of these attacks here, right? Breaking down their fortifications enough for the infantry to assault with hand grenades, flamethrowers, muskets, and melee weapons. And you can see some of that here. You can see the muskets. This is a state-of-the-art war. So Huang Jingren's fourth Naozong, the crack troops set off, transposes the overwhelming might of Qing firepower into the world of archaic battle. According to a note written by Huang, it describes the march of the elite Manchu Firearm Brigade, a portion of the Imperial Guard, from the capital to the front in the extreme southwest. And we'll see here in a second, in this song, the firearms that are ascribed to this elite force are taken from early histories. They're burning elephants used to attack the state of Wu, mentioned in the Zuozhuan. And they are fire oxen used by the general Tiandan used to rout the armies of Yan, as recounted in Shi Ji. So this is very important. These are imagined not as rudiments, laughable in comparison to the advanced weaponry of Jesuit-designed howitzers, but rather as emblems of the unstoppable power that characterizes sagely might descending upon doomed outlaws. The crack troops set off, clouds galloping, their armor a field of frost, their halberds a dense forest, their heavenly swords leaning, their moon-white feathers teeming, flower stamens and rhinoceros horns severed on land. This is apparently how sharp their swords were. They can cut flower stamens and rhinoceros horns. Nimble swans sink in the waves. Fire oxen and burrowing elephants, who dare touch or grab them? Measuring the moon in GB, Zhen, or E, their fierce fire will spread flames. So Jibi, who, if you've read your Sun Zi Bingfa, you know the Jibi Zhenni are constellations, ancient ways of telling the seasons when wind would blow and help your fire attacks on your enemy. Here, they replaced the advanced mathematics that Jesuit advisors were using to calculate projectile motion as they cast the howitzers at the front. So, in the continuation of the crack troops set off, I think you can see the strange meter that I was talking about in Huang Jingren. You don't need to know anything about Chinese history to know this is strange. Or sorry, Chinese literature to know that this is strange. So here we go. Mountains move and clouds stir, but chickens and dogs cry not out. They encircle Jingluo, waving the triaster standard. Descending from the 9 heavens, snowy mountains they topple, those stubborn fawns and fledglings soon to be in chaos. So the drama of this song builds to a crescendo of potential energy, a sense of impending force, marked in the final line by the modal soon to be, Fang. This effect is heightened by the language of celestial travel. As the firearm brigade joins the main army and prepares to attack, they encircle not the Jinchuan territories of the earth, but rather the Jingluo region of the sky, conceived in the ancient cosmological theory of field allocation, by which earthly domains were mirrored in the sky as the area of heavens corresponding to the lands of Sichuan. So stationed in Jingluo, the brigade waves not earthly battle flags, but instead the battle standard formed by the constellation Triaster, which is the 3 stars of Orion's belt. This is why, you might be wondering, this is why, though their deployment moves heaven and stirs clouds, the earthbound chickens and dogs of the Jinchuan do not cry out in alarm. The crack troops are stationed in the sky, waiting to descend from the 9 heavens and destroy. So such descriptions recall that the Manchu Firearm Brigade, as part of the Imperial Guard, were ordinarily stationed in the capital, dwelling place of the Son of Heaven, and thereby itself an earthly iteration of the celestial realm. Heavenly and divine resonances were especially pronounced in the Second Jinchuan War, because Jinchuan was a center of the Tibetan religion of Bon, with the Jinchuan kings serving as both political and religious leaders on the front, or of the region. So as a result, when war first broke out, the Qing soldiers found themselves facing not only bullets, arrows, and rocks from the Jinchuan rebels, but also magic spells cast by the Bon lamas in battle. These spells, summoning storms, and the reports from the front this is real stuff, I'm not making it up. These spells, summoning storms and disease to degrade the Qing forces, were frightening enough to cause some soldiers to run away rather than fight. The emperor and his Tibetan Buddhist allies, especially his spiritual advisor, Ronpai Dorje, sworn enemies of Bon, decided to respond in kind. Monks at the front chanted sutras for victory, and the Dalai Lama is said to have amassed 40,000 monks to pray for good weather. Meanwhile, in the capital, Ronpai Dorje and his assistants performed tantric rituals that caused fireballs to rain down. And we have witness reports of this too. Caused fireballs to rain down on the battlefield. Now, of course, there was no Bon or Buddhism in the Bronze Age. This is how Huang's songs imagine an attack by Qing forces. Troops march at night, the dew thick and wet. Feng Long rains his sound, and the rain newly cleared. Marching swiftly, the dust does not rise. Scraping the sky amid crags, war towers in hundreds. A tower falls in announcement as every camp is razed. Lightning winds through the lines of stockades, shouts rumble in the air. The throng of evildoers dreading, their bodies obliterated amid dreams. So this annihilation described in these lines is strikingly graphic, but similar images fill the other songs. Song number 7 describes an assault on the mountain stronghold, telling of Jinchuan troops filling the river, quote, like a string of fish, they floated at Sandbag Shoal. Devastating explosions ripped through the enemy positions. Earth thunder, or ground thunder, I guess, rumbles forth, shining to Mount Kunlun. Limbs ripped from bodies fly through the air. Song 8 announces the cornered beasts who fought lie stiff in the gullies. In these scenes, the ancient rhetoric of sanctioned violence and the awesome power of sagely might are energized to their utmost degree, approaching the limit of chaos put into motion by an enemy imagined to have disordered the cosmos with its insolence. But for all of their explicit violence, however, Huang Jingren's songs return the world to a state of order and cosmic harmony. Remembering that they are ritual hymns, we can describe the songs as creating a subjunctive world constituted in and of ritual practice. Nowhere is this more clear than in the penultimate song, awaiting altar offerings. Nowhere is the power of the subjunctive more clear, more disturbing, or more important for us to remember as we consider the range of the poetic imagination in 18th century China. So Huang's note on this song tells us that it depicts the ritual presentation of Jintuan war captives, which is here presented in one of the battle prints. A ceremony in which we know from external sources that the captives were brutally dismembered and beheaded, shocking the foreign dignitaries who had been invited to attend. Yet there's nothing to suggest any such violence in the song, beyond the simple statement that, quote, the guilty people are received as heaven sends down auspicious omens, and the ruling lineage is made illustrious. So our Lord says, I am but one man. How could I alone have such might? High heaven sends down auspicious light, protecting our illustrious ancestors, accepting the grand victory, blazing brightly, the guilty people received, sacrificial announcements that the tombs are complete. The line of sages illustrious, our august Lord, is congratulated. So here, I think we see a poetic meter unparalleled in its strangeness, jagged as if a broken fragment surviving from time immemorial. Yet though the rhythm is strange, the meaning is very clear. The august Lord has performed the institution of emperorship from first principles. The empire prevails and will prevail long enough to serve as a new antiquity into the future. And the poet, moreover, is the one who can create this new antiquity in song. So, looking through this lens, when then was Qing poetry? In answering the question this last time, I'm reminded of Reinhard Koselleck's famous insight that modernity, as it arose in 18th century Europe, is a time when the future is no longer expected to resemble the past. Whatever the Qing was, whatever we might call it, this was a time very aware that nothing in the past resembled it. And for this reason, it sought to fashion itself into the form of that past, a new past for a future yet, or perhaps never to come. And I think in closing, I want to say, as we think about the future of our field and where we want our research to go, what we want to do with our research, I think that looking more deeply into this structure of time would be a good place to start. Thank you.